is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's coming up to 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. Joining me on the panel, the economist and commentator Grace Blakeley, Robert Colville, he is economist on the Sunday Times and is director of the Centre for Policy Studies think tank. Ryan Shorthouse is director of the Bright Blue think tank. We're going to do a lot of thinking in this hour. And Jonathan Liss is not a director of a think tank yet.
I was.
You were, weren't you? But you were only a deputy, so that doesn't count. He's a political commentator. So we've got lots to talk about over the course of the coming hour. I'm relying on you to ask some brilliant questions to our panel. 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850. And don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
It's really funny. As you know, I haven't been here for the last week, but the previous week to that, virtually all the questions on Cross Question were about the Tory leadership contest. Not today, you'll be pleased to hear. Let's go to Martin in Doncaster for the first question. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain. Yeah, I'm glad you're better as well after your accident.
Thank you. Well, I'm not, but anyway, carry on.
Do the panel think the Lionesses winning the Euros will be a game changer?
Well, I'm going to be gratuitous and come to the only woman on the panel on this. Are you into football?
I can't say that I'm extremely enthused. I'm not an aficionado, but I did watch the game with my boyfriend yesterday. And it was very exciting for a football game. And it was obviously great that we won. I mean, I'm kind of wondering in what sense will it be a game changer? In what sense is the question being asked?
I think that there have been a lot of particularly, I think, under 10-year-old girls and teenage girls who may become very much inspired by the fact
I mean, you weren't allowed to play football as a girl at my school or any of the, like, inverted commas, boys' sport.
Posh school.
Yeah, it was about a relatively posh school. But I mean, I remember there was one girl.
Because I was a boy at my comprehensive.
Well, there we go. That's terrible. There was one girl who really wanted to play cricket, and she kind of launched a campaign to be able to join the boys' cricket team, and she was kind of bullied relentlessly for it. Eventually managed to do it, but you know, you just weren't able to play boys' sports. It was netball, and rounders was obviously a great sport, but it's not quite.
So how did the conversation go during the match between you and your boyfriend? Was he sort of chuntering along, saying, well, it's not the same as men's?
No, he was deeply enthused. I mean, he was utterly heartbroken when we lost the men's Euros, like inconsolable for weeks. So he was very, very happy yesterday and kind of a bit emotional. So it kind of, you know, I just went along with that, really.
Okay.
Not that I have much else to add.
You kind of let your sex down with that answer.
I'm sorry. I think, you know, as a woman, I should have the right to be not into football as much as I should have the right to play football.
You're absolutely right. Jonathan?
I hope it would be a game changer in the sense that women's football is taken more seriously, in the sense that, you know, women's sport should always be taken more seriously in general and seen on a level with men's sports. And the fact that we think of sport often as a default male pursuit speaks for itself. I was reading that there are some members of the team who have full-time jobs and are training to do things which is obviously unheard of in men's football, and that some, you know, a woman who is on a second tier football team might earn £21,000 a year, which is less than what a Premiership male football would earn in a week. So obviously there is a financial element, but we've seen that this has obviously generated a lot of excitement, and so there should be, you know, funding and sponsorship and actual money in it as well, so women can participate across all levels.
But I think that is where it's likely to be more of a game changer, because you can't argue that women footballers should be paid the same as men when the commercial reality is that there isn't the sponsorship there, that the crowds aren't there. You go to a Women's Super League match, and if you've got a crowd of 1,000, you're doing quite well for some of them, not all, but for some. So until the money comes in, that's
it was the biggest ever, wasn't it?
They were there last night, but that was a one-off game, and the hope has got to be that will now sort of filter down into the Women's Super League for normal matches over the course of the season. But that's not going to be a short-term thing, is it?
No, but there's no reason why in the future you couldn't see women's football in the same way that you now see women's tennis, where there genuinely is an equality. You don't assume that a major tennis match is going to be between men, and that really is as close to equality as you can get in sport. And so there's no reason why that's happened, for the last 120 years, and it hasn't happened in other sports.
Okay, Ryan?
Well, I do think women should play 5 sets, though, in the Grand Slams. I mean, that would
women
create
agree
true
with you,
equality. And I agree that they should be paid the same.
Equal pay.
Also, exactly. To be honest, like Grace, I'm not actually into football, men's or women's, so I'm a terrible person to ask. But, I mean, it was amazing, and let's hope that it increases both government and commercial funding into women's sport so that women don't have to be doing it on an amateur basis, but it's full-time professional, and it leads to, lots more girls being inspired by it. That's all I've got to say, really. That's
absolutely fine. Robert, are you going to tell me you're not a football fan as well?
No, I'm going to say I'm really happy that women's football is getting back to where it used to be before the evil patriarchy at the FA decided to effectively ban it decades ago. I think it's not just this match. The growth in profile for women's football and the growth in the quality of the games has been extraordinary and really really encouraging. But I think it's part of a broader thing. I mean, I think if you look at the Commonwealth Games, for example, you're not only I think that you're not only having the men's events and the women's events, but you're having in swimming and triathlon, for example, you're having men and women competing as in the same teams, and they've also brought the Paralympics. So not the Paralympics, but they're having the para events at the same time. And I think that's just it's whatever Obviously, the gold standard will always be the Premier League, the men's game. But whatever you can do to increase exposure, whatever you can do to for the money you spend on a single transfer, if you're a Liverpool club, you can a Liverpool or Man City, you can fund your entire you can fund a really good women's football team for an entire year. And so you don't need to get equal money. You just need to get a tiny the sponsorships and the and the coverage and the interest up to get a really good thing going.
I thought one of the interesting things yesterday was that although it is intrinsically the same sport, it's still very different, isn't it? Because the crowd sounds different. You don't have all of the theatrics where the players rolling over 10 times to sort of make out that they're injured. It was sort of almost, it was a sort of pure kind of football.
On the other hand, the Germans were putting in some reducers in the tackle. I mean, they weren't going easy. There were quite a lot.
No.
There were quite a lot of cards going.
Why should they? Yeah. That's what you expect from the Germans. But do you think that to add a note of controversiality into the conversation, as if I just didn't do that, that we're being slightly force-fed women's football? That the other day when we won the semi-final, 13 minutes on the 10 o'clock BBC News on the fact that the English women's football team had reached the final of the European Championship. And I'm thinking, are we all being told that we should like it? And I mean, I'll be completely honest, I did watch the match yesterday and I sort of vaguely enjoyed it, but I didn't find it the same. And yet there are plenty of other women's sports that I'll absolutely follow slavishly, but women's football is not one of them. And yet I'm made to feel guilty, as if I'm being somehow misogynistic.
Who's making you feel guilty for not liking it? Like, I don't like it. I don't feel misogynistic.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that.
I think the idea that we're being force-fed it is a bit much.
We are a little bit for a sport which is a minority interest sport. It has to be said.
I think it was the similar.
It is getting, I would say, more coverage than it merits.
It was a similar thing with the Euros, right? It's not just about the sport itself. It's actually about the feeling that people get participating in this mass event where everyone's watching.
Which is being hosted here as well.
Exactly. And like the excitement that there was around the men's Euros and
the Olympics as well. The Olympics, you might get, if we win a gold medal in some minority sport, that gets sort of 10 minutes at the beginning of the news as well. So it's just, whatever happens to be, and obviously it is August as well. So, there's not as much.
And also, as I suspect we'll find out over the rest of this hour, but the rest of the news is pretty awful at the moment. Like, it's not a happy place to be. So just having something, and we beat the Germans.
What's not tonight?
Yeah, exactly.
I loved, did you see the meme from Jeremy Vine today? He retweeted it from somebody else, where they've got the sort of, it says men, semicolon, it's coming home, football's coming home. And then women, 50 years later, okay, I'll fetch it then. I thought that was very funny. Right, let's move on to Martin. Thank you very much. You had to see it, maybe, rather than you telling it.
It's the way you tell them.
It isn't the way I tell them, and I think that's what we've discovered. Right, Laura is in Twickenham. Hello, Laura.
Hiya. Mine's a question in relation to your last conversation regarding the London Living Rent Scheme. I wondered if this, or why this hasn't been expanded to the rest of the country to give people the opportunity who are privately renting to save, to buy.
Now, can you explain to us in 30 seconds what the London Living Rent Scheme is?
Okay, it is a pot of money or a grant that the Mayor of London gives housing associations or councils some money for when they do new build development. He'll say, right, you need to make 10 properties, for instance, London Living Rent, which is 60 to 80% market rent tenancy for 5 years to help people be able to buy that property or another property at the end of the 5 years.
And is this working?
It is, but they're very, very hard to find. I've literally just gone into one after 20 years of privately renting. My rent is now half. It is a bit of a strict criteria with your income, but it should be promoted more with housing associations. They should be taking up the grant that he's providing, and it should be out throughout the country. Why
You
isn't
said
it?
the grant that he's providing, it's actually London taxpayers that are providing it in the end, isn't it? Robert, what do you make of this scheme?
I think anything that gets people into home ownership is a good thing. I think this is basically affordable housing, just with some extras on it. That's how affordable housing works. When developers build houses, they have to carve off a certain percentage to be done at market rate. I mean, fundamentally for me, the issue here is that we're not building enough houses. I think there's all sorts of things you can do around the edges, but we are spending the Bill for Housing benefit, which is the sort of it's effectively the nationwide version of this scheme. It's what we pay to help people live in houses who otherwise couldn't afford it. But that bill is shooting up into the billions and billions and billions and billions of pounds. And it's fundamentally, this is an issue I'm religious on, is because we haven't built enough houses. We've built fewer houses every decade since the 1960s. So there's all sorts of things you can do about how you allocate the housing and how you help people into the housing. But fundamentally, we just need more housing. And it kind of almost doesn't matter what tenure it is. We just don't have enough of it.
What about the point made by a caller in our last hour from Cambridge? He said that a lot of the houses that are being built around Cambridge, and there are a lot of them being built, they're all being bought up by investors or foreign investors, and very few of them actually go straight to a first-time buyer. Do you think there needs to be some more regulation of that?
Well, so this is something that our think tank has shown, that in the 10 years after the financial crisis, we actually, the amount of new housing we built was eclipsed by the growth of the buy-to-let sector. So effectively, we didn't build any new houses because they were just bought up by landlords, and that's been a function of partly mortgage regulation and partly interest rates. It's been so much. Basically, people have just had a lot of spare cash or been able to borrow easily and pumped it into the property sector. I don't really favour sort of artificial restrictions on who can buy what houses. I do think we need carrots, and we need carrots to persuade people to sell home ownership. I think if we're building new social housing, it should definitely be preserved for if we're doing a new the new right to buy, it should definitely be there should be covenants to restrict that for own occupation. And so, but I think some sort of thing saying banning extra homes, I just think doesn't work.
Ryan.
Yeah, I agree with Rob. There's definitely supply-side constraints in London and the South East. I would also say that the problem with housing is also a distributional one, not just a supply-side one, which is, I think you've seen in recent decades, a huge growth in people buying more than one property. I think there's a figure, a lot of baby boomers, 1 in 6 of them now have got a second home. Interest rates have been very low. It's been very easy to borrow. Often people use their first property to support them to get a second property by remortgaging it slightly. And so, for example, in terms of the growth of the private rented sector in the past few decades, that represents about a majority, 3/4 of all new homes that were built, or is equivalent to all the new homes that were built in that period. So really, you've got a bias in the market against first-time buyers. And I think the government's review of the mortgage market is probably the biggest game changer here. Many decades ago, you could get 100% mortgages. We don't have that anymore. You need a very sizable deposit, and that is the biggest barrier to a lot of first-time buyers. They could be on good wages, pay their rent on time for many, many years, but they just don't have the family support to pay the deposit. So I do think we need to look at alternatives to support people who don't have those big deposits.
Jonathan?
I think fundamentally we always come back to the fundamental principle that housing is somewhere to live, and it's been treated for many decades as an asset above all else. And from that, so many other policies follow. I don't see why we can't be much more interventional, if you like, with housing in this country, in the way that plenty of other cities across the capitalist world do. Rent caps, rent controls on who is allowed to buy property, control on how many properties someone's allowed to buy, control on how many buy-to-let properties you can have, whatever it is. We are in this position where someone's right to have as many properties, as many assets as they like from wherever they come in the world, for whatever purpose, seems to trump all other rights, and that can't be right.
Grace?
I'm, to be honest, relatively shocked to hear a level of consensus across the panel that housing has become primarily a financial asset rather than, an ordinary commodity or even like a human right, which is definitely what we've seen over the past kind of, 30, 40 years, really. This Conservative leadership race, which I know that we're not talking about too much,
but we do have a question on it.
Well, the candidates are kind of saying that they're competing to be the next Thatcher, right? And the reason that we have the housing situation that we have in this country really does go back to Thatcher. It goes back to the combination of the deregulation of the financial system with right to buy and, the massive increase in density of economic activity and therefore people in major cities that took place, over the course of the 80s and 90s. And dealing with those problems requires, as we've just heard, a whole load of different interventions. So yes, we probably do need rent caps. That would certainly disincentivise landlords from providing housing in the private rented market. That housing should then probably be taken back into the public sector as an asset, as it once was before it was sold off on the cheap at a loss. Right to buy is still the biggest privatisation that the British state has ever undertaken. And it was, again, a privatisation that was not particularly fiscally prudent, given that those assets generated revenue over the long term. So, and also because we now have this massive bill for supporting people in the private rented sector paying extortionately high rent. So we need to take a lot of housing back into the public sector. We need to build new social housing, and we need some regulation of the private rented sector, as well as disincentivising the financialisation of housing, which requires a lot of kind of regulation of the financial sector, as well as, people often have a second home because it's their pension. Pensions in this country are, exactly. I mean, pensions are terrible. Like, we have the lowest state pension of, I think, any advanced country. That's just not, I think it's like 15 grand a year or something. It's not something that people can rely on. So that requires reform as well.
And that is a real point, I think, in that people have slightly lost confidence in the pension system, so they regard property as their pension, and I'm guilty of that myself. In that, when Gordon Brown effectively ruined our pension system in 1997, I never had a big pension anyway, and still don't. I thought, well, property is the way to go. Well, and a lot of other people have thought like that, and of course we are part of the problem.
Grace is blaming Thatcher for this.
Should I not be blaming Thatcher?
As the guy who runs,
are you blaming Blair instead?
As the guy who runs a think tank founded by Thatcher, I would just point out that social housing waiting lists actually fell during the heyday of the right to buy. That the problem, because what the problem, the house prices start to absolutely mushroom under Blair, and as you said, so there's not only
there were a lot of macroeconomic reasons for that, and obviously there's a lag.
But there's not only the attack on not only attack on private pensions, but also Gordon Brown changes the mortgage rate rules to make financing buy to let cheaper than actually
that is also true.
Occupation.
I mean, I think we can't avoid the fact that housing and finance in this country are deeply interrelated, and it's like the vast majority of of bank lending in general is directed towards mortgages. And that's at least partly why we've seen the explosion in house prices that we've seen over the past several decades. I mean, it's just been, as you said, low interest rates, extremely loose monetary policy, and banks that have been willing and able to lend pretty much only to...
And legally obliged almost to lend
Often.
only.
But what we're talking about is justice, isn't it? Because you can buy a second property, and that's fantastic. And a lot of people are in a position where they can use that as their pension. But most people of our age, I'm talking, I think all of us actually, particularly in London, are not able to get on housing ladder at all. And ultimately, I think I've said to you on this programme before, if you don't solve housing, then it's in the Tories' interest to solve housing, because if young people can't become homeowners, they will not vote Conservative.
Totally agree. Robbie's written on my screen, shall we go to a break? We're
getting home
I know we're late, but we were having a very interesting discussion, I think. It's 21 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
23 minutes past 8. Grace Blakeley, Robert Colville from the Centre for Policy Studies, Ryan Shorthouse from Bright Blue, and Jonathan Liss are with us answering your calls. Now, let's go to John in Wallington. John, you've got a very meaty question for us.
I have, Iain. Evening to the panel. Given the situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, should Nancy Pelosi ignore the threats from China and go ahead and visit Taiwan?
Such a difficult question, isn't it? Because there are so many ramifications, whichever side of the argument you fall down on. Grace, let's start with you.
I was hoping you weren't going to come to me first. No.
Sorry.
It is a complicated question. And, in any of these cases, you can look at things from a kind of objective moral perspective, which I think we're wont to do when discussing them in the media, or you can look at them from a kind of realpolitik, geopolitical perspective. And from the latter perspective, I mean, obviously, it is in no one's interest to escalate a conflict that is currently taking place between two major superpowers by, drawing in another major superpower. Having said that, Taiwan is obviously a sovereign country, and China is often behaving in a way that is imperialist. So, yeah, I mean, how do you weigh up those moral versus geopolitical considerations? You have to just make a call based on, where you are.
Do you think Nancy Pelosi should go?
I don't know. Do you think Nancy Pelosi should go?
Luckily, I don't have to answer the questions. Jonathan, you're keen to get in.
It's a really interesting question. I used to cover Taiwan quite a lot in my work at the European Parliament, and I went to Taipei on a delegation. I found it absolutely fascinating, and we kind of spoke to politicians across the spectrum there to find how they kind of navigate this sort of 70-year equilibrium, this fudge, effectively, where you have this fallacy of kind of the one China policy, where each of the Chinas is effectively claiming ownership of the whole, which is obviously ludicrous, because there is no way that if you were ever to have, the fall of the Communist Party in China, Taipei would not ever be running the whole of China. You would not have the whole of China being ruled from an island, and so you just have these parties that are kind of inching towards a new position. But I think we have to put it into perspective. Taiwan, it's not really a sovereign country. It's never declared independence. It kind of claims ownership of the whole China, as I said. So it's never declared independence. If it did, that would be a declaration of war de facto. So even though at the moment you have the party, not the Kuomintang, the other party, I think it's called the DPP, which is sort of more left-wing and more kind of independently minded, they would never actually declare independence. So I think that obviously the United States has gone through a journey. Until the 1970s, it recognised Taiwan as China, and then obviously it shifted its allegiance to the Communist Party, because that, as most countries do, there are a few countries, I think a dozen countries in the world that recognise Taiwan, but that's mainly because Taiwan gives them money to do so, like many Pacific Island nations and so on. So I think that it would be a bold step for Pelosi to go, but I also think that Taiwan is doing everything it can and everything it should. It's a healthy democracy, and it has been for the last 35 years or so. And, it's standing up for itself. And those are the freedoms that Americans love to talk about. And we can see what's happening in China with the horrendous atrocities in East Turkestan, Xinjiang, and all kinds of crackdowns. And I think that it's incumbent upon the American government or the American apparatus to show some support for Taiwan. And nobody in their right minds thinks that Nancy Pelosi visiting Taipei is going to invite a nuclear response from Beijing.
Do you think she should go?
I do think she should go.
Okay. Well, that was a brilliant answer, if I may say so, because I think everyone here will have learned something from that, and everyone listening, because it's one of those international things where we've all heard of Taiwan, but how many of us really know much about it? I've got a friend who lives in Taiwan who I was thinking of visiting later in August.
You should.
Until I did my knees in.
It's an amazing country.
So I'd love to go there, but I bet I would pick the week that China invades. Knowing my luck at the moment. Ryan?
Well, I can't compete with the knowledge that Jonathan has.
I'll have a go.
But, I mean, I think I tend to agree with Jonathan that she should go and show support and solidarity with Taiwan. I think it is important that the West stands up to belligerent actors, whether it's Russia and China. And, in my view, what happened with Russia after it invaded Crimea in 2014, it was business as usual. And as a result of that, Putin has now decided to go into Ukraine because the West wasn't strong enough and changing its economic model with Russia. So I think, small acts early are better in terms of showing strength against these more belligerent actors.
Robert?
Well, I think it's fascinating the way that the US has been on a journey. I mean, and the UK has been on a journey as well. I mean, Sunak and Truss are both competing to be the most hawkish on China when, just 8 years ago, Cameron and Xi were knocking back pints at the Chequers local. So in America, I think this is actually probably arguably Trump's greatest legacy, as a decisive shift in US policy to seeing China not as a sort of a strategic partner, or even a strategic competitor, but a strategic adversary. And the US has, as Jonathan said, always had this kind of, well, not always, but ever since Nixon went to China, it's been sort of doing this delicate thing of not quite acknowledging Taiwan as a country, but not quite confirming that it would defend Taiwan, but kind of saying that but making it clear to China, it's been a very, very delicate dance, and you've seen that basically the dancing has stopped in the last few years. The US is becoming, both parties in the US are becoming much more firmly on the Taiwanese side. In terms of whether she should go, I mean, maybe it was a provocative action to decide to go in the first place, but I think once she's gone, once she's decided to go, I think pulling out and backing down would look very bad for America, and it would embolden China hugely.
Grace, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, a big part of why this conflict between the US and China has escalated has obviously been, it's centered around a trade war. It's centered around accusations of currency manipulation. It's a recognition that the US is losing geopolitical and particularly economic heft to a growing superpower that is China. And the way that that transition is handled, because it is going to be a transition, whether it's a transition that takes place over the next decade or the next 4 or 5 decades, is going to be extremely important. And over the last kind of 10 years or so, it's been handled very badly by the US. As you just mentioned, both the Democrats and the Republicans have been very hawkish on China.
But China
and
itself,
even if it meant damaging their own economy, which they did through this trade war.
China has become massively more aggressive. The Wolf Warrior diplomacy. If you look at the indices of attitudes towards China in every single country, pretty much they have gone very, very strongly negative in the last few years.
That index changed extremely quickly over the course of COVID because China was, Donald Trump was out there saying it was the China virus or whatever.
Over the last 10 years, it's not COVID.
There was a big shift during COVID where people suddenly thought, oh, the COVID is all China's fault. You cannot, I think, dismiss that as an issue. And if you look back to the period immediately after the financial crisis, it was the Chinese stimulus package that largely saved the global economy from, falling into a much more significant recession. There is no avoiding the fact that China is now a huge economic, financial player in the world economy. And it doesn't make sense on any level to have the two world's largest economies at each other's throats and fighting a trade war against one another. So I think they have to figure out a way of coming to some sort of, way of living alongside one another, basically.
I think everyone will agree that obviously we all need to exist with China and that obviously China has real problems and it's also, one of the world's largest economies. It will be the biggest economy in the world in a few years' time. And clearly we need to kind of make our peace with that. But I think there is a delicate equilibrium.
Of course,
with that. And Taiwan, the worst thing of all is if Taiwan sort of became collateral damage in this superpower clash, and in a similar way the Ukraine has.
But on the economic thing, we've seen what dislocation has been caused by Russia. The damage to if someone basically blows up Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturers, or the Taiwanese blow them up to prevent the Chinese getting hold of them, that is a multi-billion-dollar hit to the world. It's the most damaging thing to the world economy.
Well, exactly, which is why it requires a little bit more cool heads to prevail in any of these conflicts. You can look at this as the way I think that perhaps Donald Trump looked at it, which is we are losing at the expense of China, or you can look at the way that the world economy works as something that's much more interrelated and it requires us to cooperate.
OK, well, stupid tweet of the day goes to S. Hill, who says, now Iain Dale is encouraging mass air travel by saying that he'd love to visit Taiwan. People in his position should set a climate example that he just keeps everything cosy and fun.
Does LBC have a private jet?
Seriously, no. I have been, I think, on a plane once in the last 4 years. So I think I can be forgiven a holiday at some point.
Ian, you didn't say you wanted to fly there. You could have. You could take
a train,
a cruise,
or a cruise.
No, I'm not really into cruising. Why is that?
Take a break. That took me a while, but I got it.
Anyway, on that note, let's go to the news headlines at 8:33 with Andy Ivy.
Former Conservative leadership candidate Penny Mordaunt has announced she's supporting Liz Truss in the race for number 10. The Trade Minister says her colleague is the hope candidate in the contest for Downing Street. The parents of Archie Battersby say they'll apply to the Supreme Court to try to stop the 12-year-old's life support being turned off. He's being treated at the Royal London Hospital, which says it will prepare to withdraw treatment after midday tomorrow, unless directed otherwise. Several of England's Euro 2022 winning team are being honoured by their hometowns to recognise their achievement. Skipper Leah Williamson will be the first person to receive the freedom of Milton Keynes since it became a city. Chloe Kelly, who scored the winning goal against Germany yesterday, has also been offered the freedom of the borough of Ealing in West London. LBC weather tonight: rain in the northwest, dry and muggy in the south. Tomorrow, rain in central areas, very warm across southern and eastern England, and a high of 28 degrees.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question with Jonathan Liss, a political commentator, Ryan Shorthouse, director of the Bright Blue think tank, Robert Colville, who's director of the Centre for Policy Studies and a Sunday Times columnist, and Grace Blakeley, the economist and commentator, who has lots of books out. Would you like to name one of them?
Oh, Iain, thank you for that plug. Yeah, so my first book is called Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialisation. The second one is called The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism. The third one is as yet unnamed. Well, it's not been released yet, and we haven't quite decided on a title. It will be coming out next year in April. It's about democratising the economy.
Big topics.
That sounds a
I hope you'll
riveting
have me
read.
on. Well,
I'm sure I will.
I'm just wondering what's next after the presidents and prime ministers.
Oh, yeah.
The chancellors of Germany.
No. We're doing. But the next book is called On This Day in Politics: British Political History in 365 Days.
That's fun.
I love that.
Very good.
Great. You should
Very
make a
good
calendar.
Christmas present book
With pictures.
out on the 6th of October. Anyway, I'm going to get shouted at in a minute. Sean in Concert is our next caller. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Iain, mate. Hello, panel. I'm getting a book out. I cannot stand the Tories. That's what I've called it. But anyway, that's another section.
You surprised me.
Can you tell me if Keir Starmer shot himself in the foot with the unionists after controlling these sidekicks?
What you mean by sacking Sam Tarry over the, ostensibly over attending a picket line?
Mandy should take over.
Well, she attended a picket line today, didn't she?
Yeah, no, that's good for her. Good for her. We're the working class, mate, not the Tories.
Okay, Sean. Grace, you complained when I came to you first on a difficult question.
This is fine.
So
I'm happy. This
this
is good. I completely agree with what Sean just said. The clue's in the name. It's the Labour Party. The Labour Party was formed by unionists, by organised labour to represent the interests of working people. The fact that Keir Starmer has been singularly unable to do that during the biggest upsurge in labour militancy that we've seen since the 1970s, when working people are literally organising to avoid pay cuts, because unless you're getting a wage increase in line with inflation, you are getting a pay cut at a time when costs are rising across the board after a decade of wage stagnation, in the midst of a housing crisis. The fact that the party of working people cannot stand with working people who are literally just saying, we want our wages to be raised in line with inflation, is, to be honest, utterly astonishing. And I would not be surprised if unions like, for example, Unite, did decide we want to disaffiliate from the Labour Party because it is not doing its job. Its job is to represent the interests of working people. And at the moment, it is not doing that.
But if you were leader of the Labour Party and one of your front benchers... You said it. And one of your front benchers directly disobeyed an order not to attend a picket line, and then not only that, went on the world's media and announced policies that weren't official party policy. You couldn't stand for that, could you?
Well, look, I think the issue is here that Keir Starmer ran on a platform where he said he would stand by trade unions, where he said that he would support a bunch of policies that he has now just completely denied ever having any knowledge of. And the fact that some of his front benchers, the fact that some of his MPs are themselves taking responsibility to push for those policies in public is, I think, legitimate and correct. I don't think you can have a moral problem with members of the Labour Party, pushing for policies that Keir Starmer himself just, a few years ago said that he would support.
Ryan?
Well, I think a party which is aspiring to be in government needs to be in the business of finding solutions in disputes rather than taking one side or the other. And I think there's a real risk for the Labour Party.
But they're not in government now, are they? And
they're not in government, but they're aspiring to be in government.
They are the party of the workers, supposedly.
Yes, but they're aspiring to be a party of government. And what I would say is that, at the moment, Mick Lynch has a lot of popularity, particularly in the world of Twitter and social media. But as the strikes continue, I think the public will become increasingly frustrated. And if the Labour Party is so strongly behind the unions in the dispute, then it risks its reputation in that way.
Robert?
Well, I don't think anyone is outside Westminster bubble really has noticed this or is going to care about it come the election. Like Sam Tarry is not going to be a name to conjure with come the next general election. But I think what it does show is how divided the Labour Party is, and how as Grace said, actually, how Starmer is sort of torn in two directions. He is trying to sort of present himself as the moderate. He has completely thrown over the pledges on which he stood. But then there's large sort of sections of his party tugging him back in that direction, and it kind of makes him look weak. It kind of makes Labour look ineffective. I don't think it's the hugest thing in the world, but I don't think it's a good look, and I think it's going to leave a sort of bitterness within the Labour movement that is going to last, especially if the unions do decide, right, we've had enough of this.
Because, Jonathan, it does take a special talent, doesn't it, that when the Tory party is ripping itself apart and providing all sorts of opportunities for Keir Starmer, then the Labour Party starts ripping itself apart as well.
Well, let's say the Labour Party is always ripping itself apart, no matter who's in charge. And there's nothing new about that. But I do think that Starmer is playing a very dangerous game. And I would not advise him to be playing it if I were advising him, which is he thinks he's going to do what Blair and Kinnock did and pick a fight with the unions to make him look tough, to take a stand, to make himself look prime ministerial. But the problem with that is that, firstly, a lot of people that he needs to win over are sympathetic to labour conditions, sympathetic to striking workers, sympathetic to workers in general. They might be workers themselves, for heaven's sake. But also, if he is daring the unions to disaffiliate or to stand up to him or to withdraw their funding or whatever it might be, then they might just call his bluff. And if they do, then he's really got trouble. He's got political trouble because there's that, precipitates, all-out war in the Labour Party and party management and also a massive financial problem. How do you plug that funding gap in the Labour Party if you have, a massive chunk of its funding?
But presumably, to fight an election.
And presumably, if the unions do that, I mean, the only real opposition to the Tory Party is the Labour Party. If they're not going to be sustainably funded, then you're going to end up with years of Tory government.
A battle, don't you? Because obviously he thinks that that's what they think, that any Labour Party would be better than any Tory government. And obviously I think that, and a lot of people think that, but he can't be sure there aren't people in the unions who don't think that. And they think that if you're just going to have someone who's not prepared to stand up for working people, who's going to be Tory light, then just let the Tories do their worst.
There are going to be a lot of people who will also be looking at this and just thinking, what is the Labour Party for if it cannot stand up for just a basic maintenance of people's wages at a time of, the biggest cost of living crisis we've seen, at least since, the oil price spike in the 1970s, probably, ever, really. And that is especially the case when you look at the history, because the last time you were talking about Blair and Kinnock, the last time that we had politicians going to war with the Labour movement was strong. It was a force in this country that could literally shut the country down. We have had, again, since Thatcher, who went to war with and ultimately destroyed much of the Labour movement, a secular decline in membership of the UK's unions, which is a big part of why we're in the situation we're in today.
If workers can't, to go up a little.
It is actually, yeah. Since I think about 2016, and at least partly that's been because, I would argue there has been more positive, coverage of unions and unionists in the media. Often by socialists, because the socialist movement is basically grounded in the Labour movement, the reason that obviously we've had this decade of wage stagnation, the reason that we're in this deep cost of living crisis right now, is that when you don't have union coverage in the private sector, people simply cannot bargain for higher wages, which means that their wages are going to be eroded when prices go up. That is why we have the cost of living crisis we have right now. And you can talk all you want about what the government should be doing to deal with it, but unless people's wages are rising, then this is going to continue to be a problem.
It's so strange because the Labour Party, Starmer says we need to be a party in government, but we're not a party of opposition. But right now they are a party of opposition. And when you're in opposition, you need to actually show people what you believe in. He's very good at showing, and I support him. I want Labour to win, of course, but he's very good at showing people what he's against the Tory party, rightly. So they're against poor conditions, fine. But when it comes to basic questions like Grace is talking about, are you advocating, a pay cut for workers? That should be a basic principle for the Labour Party. And all this stuff about wage price spirals, it's actually not true. It doesn't work like that. And instead of looking at wages, you'd be looking at profits if you want to tackle the cost of living crisis. So there's nothing wrong with a Labour leader saying that people shouldn't get a pay cut.
Well, the counterfactual would be that if you're a hard-pressed commuter struggling to get into work, and you see the bloody unions are striking again, and you can't get into your job, and you see the Labour Party front bench on the front lines with them holding the banners. I mean, it's just like, and then you think, oh, nothing's changed. It's Corbyn all over again.
I mean, if you actually look at the statistics, people are generally very supportive of the strikers. And actually, the more coverage there has been of the strikes, the more supportive people have been. There was that week where I was on Good Morning Britain that week, and I think they did a poll. And they did the poll at the beginning of the week and then at the end of the week.
Walked out?
No, that was another time. And it just showed that, public support had really rallied behind the Labour movement. And I think that the more we see, honest working class unionists in the media fighting for their rights, the more support there's going to be.
It's interesting on the train strikes because as people have worked from home much more since the pandemic, people are probably using the train less frequently in the working week. The type of people who use trains tend to be more white collar, middle class in general, not always exclusively, and they're more likely to be able to work from home. So it probably hasn't felt that disruptive, some of the strikes thus far. But I think the risk is, as it continues and no resolution is found, then you get to the position that Robert's saying, which is, people do start to get pissed off about it, and that's a threat to the reputation of the Labour Party.
Apologies.
Are we allowed to swear? I was going to say,
sorry,
God.
apologies. Sorry.
I never thought you'd be.
I know. Sorry, that's
Even
bad.
after 9 o'clock, that might be.
Sorry.
Apologies to anyone who's offended by that. Goodness me, I'd have expected it for Jonathan. But not you.
I've never sworn on radio or television.
Peter in East Grinstead has a comment on tonight's programme. He says, one of the best cross questions makes a nice change from politicians trying to score points off each other. Well done. Maybe we should just do cross questions without any politicians forever. Now there's a thought
that would be
to
nice.
ponder on. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
A superb performance by the Lionesses. That's what winning looks like and feels like. The extra time winner and, of course, the fantastic celebration that's followed. It's been 56 years we're waiting that long for an international football tournament victory for England. 6 decades. And how often have we watched it slip away? Too often at the hands of Germany. The Lionesses rewrote history. They become, I suppose, the history girls.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
More
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Paul says, Iain, would you please introduce think tanks with their political stance? Well, I thought Bright Blue was a bit of a giveaway. And Robert did say that his own think tank was founded by Margaret Thatcher and indeed Sir Keith Joseph. So again, I think we've covered our bases on that one. Jonathan Liss and Grace Blakeley do not have think tanks yet. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Mary in Glasgow. Liz Truss has tonight called Nicola Sturgeon an attention seeker, suggesting the best way to respond to her complaints is to ignore her. Is this a responsible way for a possible Prime Minister to behave, or is she right? Well, since that text came in, our eager beavers have found the sound clip of Liz Truss saying that this evening in Exeter.
And I think the best thing to do with Nicola Sturgeon is ignore her. I think she's... I'm sorry.
It's a bit difficult when she's First Minister, though. She's got a democratically elected position, just as you would.
I'm sorry, she's an attention seeker, Seb. That's what she is.
An attention speaker who's appearing at my Edinburgh Fringe programme next week. So... Ryan, let's come to you. You can't ignore the First Minister of Scotland, can you?
I mean, all politicians are attention seekers, aren't they? So, I'm
or
not sure about
people who come on this programme.
But, well, that's true. We are all attention seekers in political public life. I mean, at the end of the day, Nicola Sturgeon, as you say, is the First Minister of Scotland. The issue around the independence of Scotland, the growing support for it, the victories of the SNP does mean that at some point there is going to have to be a second referendum. I don't know. I don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And whether it will be in Liz Truss's premiership or not, I don't know. But the one thing I would say about that clip is that Liz Truss has, got lots of claps, lots of applause. She's very good at this sort of stuff. And that surprised a lot of people. And I think, the thing about Liz Truss is that she's been continuously underestimated in politics. But she's proving herself to be a very effective campaigner. And that's why I think, she's doing so well with the Tory membership.
Robert Colville, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall when Prime Minister Truss and First Minister Sturgeon meet for the first time?
Yes, although let's hope it doesn't get a front cover which is talking about the
Lexit.
Talking about the length of their skirts, as happened with Theresa May. I think it's a really good point actually, and it's not a sort of it's not belittling Nicola Sturgeon. It's the point. The point is there are. If you want to keep the union together, there are various that you can go hard, you can fight, you can try to rebut every single thing Nicola Sturgeon says. I think what Truss is advocating there is an approach which is just more kind of let her howl into the void. Don't confront her. Just let the SNP's monomania on this issue kind of highlight itself, because the fact is the SNP's obsession with independence is letting down the people of Scotland. There's all sorts of the education, the drug death stuff, the education performance. Scotland there are so many things which the government should be focusing on and should be held accountable for, and it's just turns everything into being about independence, and that really does shortchange the Scottish people.
The support for independence does continue to rise.
No, it doesn't.
But Robert,
they keep getting elected.
But Robert, there's a fun. Robert,
it rose, and then it's been tailing off gradually. I mean, it's still very substantial. But you said growing support. It's not growing.
No, there's a fundamental problem with what you're saying. Is that you don't have the right to dictate to a government what its agenda should be. The Scottish people have voted in this particular government, which had independence, an independence referendum, not even independence, an independence referendum,
which they said settled the question for a generation.
No, they didn't say that. In 2016. They said, as Sturgeon said, that, and she had it in her 2016 Scottish Parliament manifesto, that if there was a material change in circumstances, which everyone can agree Brexit was, then that would relitigate the case.
Sturgeon is trying to hold an illegal referendum in order to distract from her own failings.
Well, look, first of all, it hasn't been determined illegal yet.
It's going to be determined it's illegal.
Well, okay, fine. Well, let's wait for the Supreme Court to say what they think about the legality of it. It's actually not the point. If the Scottish people cannot be kept in the union by force. You're talking about how. Well, then, what are the options for seceding from the union? What options the Scottish people have? The SNP has stood on a manifesto of holding a new independence referendum in the last 4 national elections in Scotland, and it has won every single one of those elections. What more can the Scottish people do?
And before some of those votes, including the last one, it said this is not a referendum on independence. This is, and then as soon as it was elected, anyone, actually,
what do you mean? It had an independence referendum in its 2017 general election manifesto, 2019, last 2021. What more? How can the Scottish people request a referendum? And how on earth is it for one person in Downing Street, be it Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, to overturn the rule, the Scottish
people do probably want a referendum. They do not want one now.
But they've elected a government which wants one. It had it in its manifesto. In the same way that in 2019, the people of Britain elected the Conservative government, not with a plural majority of voters, but they, with 47%, I think, of the voters in Britain elected a Conservative government. So if you'd had a kind of an idea of numerical majority, then we'd have had to have an independence a new Brexit referendum.
Grace.
I mean, on some level, I don't actually disagree with what you've said there about the focus on independence distracting from a lot of other issues. I do also think that a big part of the reason for the ongoing popularity of the SNP is that they kind of are trying to represent this kind of third force in British politics, which is progressive on a lot of issues in line with most of the Scottish population. And also, they have marketed themselves as relatively progressive on a lot of economic issues as well. And this is, I think, a big reason why people continue to support Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. It's because she is basically kind of trying to market the Scottish model as a break with the, ongoing neoliberal, like Thatcherite, basically consensus that dominates in the rest of the country. But having said that, and I actually think, to be honest, that the kind of the language that Liz Truss is using here, which is clearly incendiary and designed to play to the crowd that she is addressing, only exacerbates the problem, which is that the ongoing focus on independence as the only issue that matters in Scotland, will continue to distract from those issues. Having said that, as Jonathan said, it is entirely up to the Scottish people to decide this. And obviously, given their ongoing support for the SNP, which, it's in the name, is about independence, they should be able to have another referendum.
Let's squeeze in one final question from Kevin in Oxford. Kevin, hello.
Hello, Iain.
Hi, what's your question, please?
So, question is, does Penny Mordaunt's endorsement of Liz Truss tonight just go to show that British politics is rotten to the core?
Why do you think it does?
Because I think Penny Mordaunt was offering an alternative 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I just think it's just a kind of a self-serving move. I think she's.
But there are only 2 candidates left, and she has to, like all Conservative Party members, she has to choose between them, and she's made her choice. Robert Colville. Try and keep your answers quite short.
Yeah, well, all I'll say on this is that 2 years ago I placed a small bet on Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister, the next Prime Minister, at 150 to 1. So I am obviously very much hoping that
thereby proving that British politics is.
Is that insider trading?
I would have to have influence over it for it to be insider trading.
I have declared this at every possible opportunity.
That is why I never bet on politics, because I think political betting, if you're involved in politics, is insider trading. But there we are. Controversial.
Well, I mean, you have to have privileged information.
I don't think, unless you have privileged information, it's different. I mean, if you're a regular punter, it's different. I think that, that I don't have a lot to say about this. I suspect that Mordaunt doesn't have a lot in common with Truss, but I think that Mordaunt.
Well, they are both Conservatives.
I think Mordaunt let herself down quite a bit in the campaign by sort of abandoning quite a few of the principles that she'd had, which actually a lot of people on the left had welcomed, such as the trans issue. But fundamentally, Mordaunt is a politician, and she sees which way the wind is blowing, and she obviously presumably thinks she's going to get a job in Truss's cabinet, and it's much better to support Truss than Sunak at that point.
Ryan.
Well, she's not a sore loser, and she's moved on from the leadership race, and she thinks Liz is the better candidate. And as I've said, a lot of people have underestimated.
Who are you backing?
I'm not backing anyone. I think the strengths of Liz is that she is very fearless. She's very determined. She's got a very clear vision. Everyone making her out to be sort of horribly right-wing, when actually her economic policy is very similar to the Labour Party's, which is to go for growth and to reverse some of the tax rises that Rishi Sunak has proposed. But I think her weaknesses is that she can be very ideological and rigid, I think Rishi is much more details orientated. William Hague put out quite an impressive video endorsing Sunak today, where he talked about the qualities of Rishi as somebody who really likes to understand stuff, is very details orientated. But as a result of that, I think he can be a bit of a technocrat and lose overall vision and seem to flip-flop a bit, which is what's happened during his time as Chancellor and during this campaign.
Grace, very quickly.
Firstly, Liz Truss's economic policy is definitely not left-wing. I don't think there are many people who would say that tax cuts for the rich and for corporations is a particularly left-wing policy, particularly at a time when we are experiencing high inflation, which is primarily being driven by profits. But that aside,
primarily driven by profits.
Yes, there's lots of evidence right now that suggests that a big part of the inflation that we're seeing at the moment is actually being driven by profits rather than wages. And if you break it down, profits more than wages, which is unsurprising given the level of wage stagnation.
COVID, anyway.
Well, when you break down who's benefiting from the increase in inflation, if you've got prices rising and costs remaining the same or costs rising at a certain level.
Back to the question: Does Penny Mordaunt's backing of Liz Truss prove that British
politicians, as we've heard already from across the panel, are self-interested. They are interested in power. That is their job. We cannot expect anything else from them.
Not solely. Yes, they are interested.
I think ultimately we need to
cynical view of politics.
You have to be, and I think if you want to be able to influence politics, you have to make your voice heard. How do you make your voice heard? You participate in a movement to make sure that politicians think it is in their interest to listen to you. That is how we've shifted the dial on climate. That is how we've slowly began to shift the dial on the economy. It's by people getting out there onto the streets, engaging in trade unionism, engaging in social movements to say there will be a cost to you as a politician if you do not listen to us. So in a sense, that means politics is rotten, but that is just
3-4 years talking about.
Yeah, and you know what? Our political debate has changed dramatically as a result of the social movements that mobilised behind Corbyn, particularly if you look at issues like climate, but also much more generally on the economy.
Right.
Stuff like levelling up is what
David
socialists
Cameron
have
was
been saying for
hugging
ages.
Huskies long before anyone had ever heard of Jeremy Corbyn.
Climate change was
quick
not.
Fun text for the end of the programme. We're running vastly over time, so very quickly here. Pauline in Slough. Big Brother is set to return on ITV2 next year. Would the panellists be interested in becoming housemates, and who would they like in there with them? Jonathan?
Absolutely not. But if I was parachuted in for a vast sum of money, then I guess I'd want all kinds of people from the left and right, so we could just talk about politics all day long.
Oh God, I can't
That would be a ratings killer, wouldn't it?
Hopefully, if there are any single attractive gay men in there, fantastic. What can I say? I'm only human.
No, I don't think I would want to go on there. I don't think I'd be interesting enough. I'd probably be voted out very early.
Don't do yourself down.
Who would I like to go on? Just somebody who I could have a laugh with, really. Who's that?
Miriam Margolyes.
Yes, I think she'd be amazing.
That would be fun, yeah.
Grace?
Again, no, I don't think I would go on. But if I did, I think I'd like to be on with Tom Hardy, maybe Ryan Gosling.
Oh, shallow.
Just some people that I could look
boring,
at.
actually.
Yeah, but it would just be. I think it would just be quite nice. If you're going to do something like that and embarrass yourself, then you may as well do it surrounded by nice-looking people.
Well, I wouldn't do it, not least because my kids would murder me for being away from them for so long. But I'd actually take Johnson's model of just some people like some really politics and history nerds who we can just have lots of
it'd be interesting.
Emily Thornbury. Emily Thornbury is good fun.
The Queen,
yes.
Emily Thornbury.
She's very
I
good
thought you meant you would want to be in with the Queen.
Interesting. That'd be an interesting Big Brother.
The producers of Big Brother are listening. I'm up for it. Thank you very much indeed. Robert Colville, Grace Blakeley, Ryan Shorthouse and Jonathan Liss. Lots of people saying we should never have politicians on again. I'm not quite sure that will last, but you never know. You're listening to LBC. I'm a very bad presenter. It's 9:04.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.